Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Artist Response to a Moment. My name is Joy Davis. I am the manager of adult and community programs here at the Walters Art Museum, and I have the esteemed pleasure of interviewing Nakeya Brown today, a local artist, and I'm really excited to get into these questions. But first, I just want to say welcome, Nakeya.
Thank you.
And so we have a PowerPoint to show you today of some of your amazing work. And we're getting started here with X-pressions. In some of your work, you do center objects or still lifes with people that are for people that are familiar with your work, they would have seen that often. But what do you think is powerful about still lives in general?
I think what turned me to wanting to work with looking at objects in terms of including them in my photography really came out of, it's probably unexpected for people to hear this, but really it came out of motherhood and needing really to just kind of slow down and needing time to actually be able to balance everything that was going on in my life. I also think simultaneously, I was really interested in thinking about other ways to represent female experiences and the sort of like in a more nuanced way, and thinking about how can we talk to one another, not by like looking at the figure, but also like, what do we keep in our house? What do we keep in our lives? What are the small, everyday, mundane items of self-care that really kind of get overlooked, but are really integral in tying us together as women, specifically as Black women. And I really found that in searching for that like common experience, I've been like looking at like hair products and looking to sort of how we express ourselves in that way. So working with the still life really came out of a necessity in a way.
Wow, I mean, I really do like the idea of us considering what we use on a daily basis and kind of things, not just around our home, but just like continual items that we use and kind of the importance and reverence that we hold for them without really thinking about it. Maybe some people may. But kind of these things that we do subconsciously and the relationship we have to certain objects subconsciously is really fascinating. And we have an example from our collection of a still life. It may seem familiar to some. And this is Still Life with Basket of Oranges from Leon Bolvin. And I'm curious for you, what is a particular, there's many differences and similarities between classical still lifes and your work, but I'm curious for you, what is an important distinction that you make in your work from what could be seen as traditional still lifes?
I do think that component of sort of like Black womanhood and that component of like our lived experiences and that shared history. When I'm like sort of searching for objects to photograph, I often am looking for like certain strands of stories that have happened to Black women. So for example, if I'm interested in talking about hair, but I'm sort of interested in like what were some laws that were like enacted against Black women, or what were some ways that like Black-owned businesses sort of band together to uplift the community. And so when you kind of look into my objects or into my still lifes, you'll start to see like very small remnants of those actions that take place within like the Black hair industry or within the Black hair culture. So in particular with these two pieces, one kit is a Black-owned kit. Then you know that it's Black owned because it has the Proud Lady symbol, the Abahi symbol on it. And so when I'm building my still lifes, I always try and see what moments in history that can be like revealed subtly through the image. But also like thinking about beauty for Black women and how it is a fraught sort of like experience that we all kind of go through, where, you know, you're kind of looking to these beauty products and they're selling the same thing, permed hair, straight hair, like the ideas of beauty is very narrow. You often might see like lighter skinned Black women with like straight hair. Like how often do you get to see, women of more diverse appearances? And so, when I'm making my still lifes, I do think about that, and I do things with the objects and with the images to try and make that apparent. And so within these images, I was thinking about like the archetype, like the Black female archetype of beauty, and just like this really like unresolved relationship that I have with like perm kits, and like the ideologies that are tied behind them, like straight hair, it's beautiful, it's desirable, assimilate, change yourself for this. And so knowing that, it's a Black owned kit and the money from this kit is being ushered into communities and scholarships and, different programs and grants, but then also knowing my own personal history with, perm kits and like how that was such a unforgettable part of my childhood I just can't erase. And so you'll kind of see like this tension between making something that I really feel good about and I like to look at and, is like sort of makes you nostalgic and reminisce about those things. But it also, there's something else happening with the obscuring of the faces that says, hey, erasure, and sometimes you kind of get stuck and lost behind these ideologies that these perm kits produce.
Yeah, I think now perm kits are even a little more politicized than I grew up thinking about them being. But I think, it's interesting how you're able to shape that narrative of something that's personal and may not apply to everyone, either in the Black community or otherwise, and kind of pair that and articulate that in a still life is I think a complex way to explore it. Especially for some of these products, like some people are familiar, some aren't, and some of it is like localized or regionalized or through certain cultures. And so I think it's really interesting to kind of display it in this way, and again, have a reverence for some of these objects that we don't necessarily have reverence for, even though we use them. We have brand loyalty in some ways for some of these products and objects. My next question is going to shift just a bit. And because we in prepping for this, we talked a little bit about how your work engages with Caribbean history and your family. And I'm curious, why is this important to you? I think it can be obvious, but I think the audience would love to know. And what works have you created that are best examples of this influence?
Yeah, so we're gonna in the coming slides, we'll actually like look at the works that are the best examples. But because I was really sort of interested in like women's history and thinking about like what are our experiences, I was looking to myself a lot with a lot of my work, and I found that like I would always kind of pull from memories of my grandmother. I would always refer back to memories with my mother being there, all of us together. And so I really wanted to make something that was a little bit more autobiographical, that looked at the influence of my Caribbean grandmother. She was actually born in Jamaica and emigrated here. And she lived her life in New York. And so from as long as I can remember, she was just always working. Like from like 5 a.m., she was like the first one up making breakfast to like just being up at night, cooling off, like laying in the bed, watching her news on her rotary phone where her legs crossed. And she's just,
I love it.
Yeah. And I just have these very vivid memories of her before she passed. And so I wanted to make a work that really celebrated her legacy. And my grandmother actually, when she came to the States, she worked as a housekeeper. And so she worked in private homes, in institutions. She worked at a New York Presbyterian hospital up until she passed away. And so I sort of used and thought about my grandmother as a way to explore women's work and the invisibility of labor that happens, and the domestic workers movement. And I was just kind of like, wow, my grandmother was a part of this. Like, you know, I have pictures of her protesting. She also worked like a factory, and she wasn't necessarily protesting at the domestic workers movement, but she was protesting at another place. And so I know that she was politically active and she thought about these things. And so I wanted to make a work that kind of brought in her Caribbean background and thinking about sort of what I saw from her on a day-to-day, and then how I could make still lifes that sort of serve as a metaphor for the work and the labor, how she was tied to the American home, but kind of rendered invisible as the way that the middle class was able to sustain itself. It was through her work. And so I actually read a really great book. It's called Household Workers Unite: The Untold Stories of African-American Women Who Built a Movement by Pramila Nadesan. I wanted to write that down so I didn't get it wrong. But when I read that, they also talked about how government agencies were set up to bring Caribbean immigrants into middle-class homes as house workers. And so I was just really interested in that part of history where the Caribbean, my grandmother's female identity, how it is invisibly tied to housework and the middle class. And so these are two pictures that are a part of a larger series, my thesis series that I made in 2016 as a grad student at George Washington University. And I chose these because the flower motif inspired the still lifes that are to come. And so just in my research, I also learned that Black women had a lot of jobs, right? We've done a lot. And one of the jobs that I never knew about but had learned, but we were also artificial flower makers. You would sew and build artificial flowers. And so my grandmother loved gardens and she loved to grow flowers. Her nickname was Primrose. And as you can see, she acquires her washing machine and she has her flowers in the background. And the second image, Grandma's Jamaican table, those are her kids, 3 of her 4 kids. And if you get really close, you can see that those are floral poinsettias on her table. And so I was really interested in the floral motif, and how I could kind of bring all of that into shaping this sort of image of my grandmother's legacy in the house, in the home, working outside the home, working in other homes. So it's just a lot. A lot of this work is about labor and domestic work and uplifting yourself and the legacy of a very powerful, strong woman that most people probably won't know, but she's my hero. She's who I I just love to uplift her.
I do. I think it's, you're providing a platform for her, right? So I do think that more people will know her story because of that. But I also think I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the picture to the left is very reminiscent of your work.
Yes.
And, some of the work we'll be looking at in just a moment. And I know that there are some familial influences throughout your work that we will see, but I don't know if you want to mention any in particular, or what other familial influences there are in your work.
I've been able to collaborate actually with my cousin, and you'll actually see her in the slide in the Reputation of Good Hair. She actually sat for me. She was willing to try out this crazy idea that I had. And she was like, yeah, Kia, you just tell me when to be there and I'm there.
That's family.
I've collaborated with it was more conceptual in terms of I wasn't like shaping a narrative around her biographical story. It was more so like, hey, I have this idea. Would you like do me a favor and eat this hair? And she was like, okay, yeah. So there's been collaborations with family.
That's awesome.
My sister, how could I not forget, like not mention my sister? Oh my goodness. Like my sister's an artist and she's let me photograph her a bunch of times. She's like sat in. So yeah.
And as we are exploring more of this familial influence from your grandmother, like this floral background that you mentioned before, even in your just general still lives, even when they are against maybe a more matte background, you have an extensive use of color and light, and you shift that even in your work that may seem a little more monochromatic. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about that and why it's important to you to kind of shift and change or some of your choices in using color and light.
Yeah, there's so many ways. I mean, I think with photography, you're constantly thinking about light. Like without light, where is your image? But I often look to, it just depends on the series and what I'm trying to accomplish. It depends on the space I'm in. It depends on like physical space. Like, am I in my living room? Or am I outside at a friend's? Am I in a studio for grad school? Am I in a studio for a residency? I don't have a fixed studio space. I kind of just, wherever I put my feet is where I'm going to make my work. Like, I just don't, that's just the way I was raised to like make it work. In terms of the colors, I definitely look at the objects and sort of let the objects drive sort of the palette of the picture. So maybe I'll start with like a background that I'm really like a really striking background or a striking object, and I'll just kind of build around that thing, like that becomes the hero. Lately, my use of light has also just been shifting a little bit because like the time in which I have to actually make my work is changing. So, I became like my first daughter I had in 2012. And then I gave birth to my second in 2019. And so with two children, it's just kind of easier to like work at night. So I've just been like adjusting with using lights in that way and like becoming more comfortable with like allowing light to become a part of the picture. Typically,
how you see light, I'm sure you're working in a completely different dimension or time of day.
Yeah. So, just kind of a lot of my light use really just kind of depends on my life.
And I wanted there was a piece that you pulled from our collection, Boston street scene, that I think has some relevant like colorways that are similar in your work. And then we move on to a few more from your Mass Production Comes Home series. And I'm curious, because you're using, this seems like it's more cooking based, but you do, as you can see through some of these other images, and I'll skip over this just a moment, they have kind of like a general theme to them. And I'm curious if that also plays into how you're using color, is thinking thematically and thinking about, you're almost really you're doing almost a production set, right? It comes very close. I wouldn't say that it is holistically for the market, right? But like it gets very close to kind of centering particular objects. And I wanted to know if that was intentional or, and how you use light or color.
I guess so, because I am sort of like when I was setting those up, I was sort of thinking about, well, what items are circulating on the market and how do they come into the home? I do also like, as I was sort of like making these works, and even before I made them, I was already kind of like doing this, but like looking at like advertising photography. I actually used to be like a rep for 4 years. And a lot of the guys that I worked with, they were like still life photographers. So I spent 4 years of my life looking at advertising photography. And so I do think I have sort of like, I take from whatever experience I have in my life, I take it and I bring it in. And I do kind of think that like that probably also comes into play when thinking about like composition and framing and color within my work. So yeah, I do think that, you know, there is a sense of like a production that goes into the still lifes that I'm sort of like pulling together, thinking about how does color communicate with the image? Like, how do the colors of these as a whole communicate? And so like allowing that to kind of drive some of my editing choices, like what makes it out versus, you know, what doesn't, in terms of, yeah, putting all the work together.
We also pulled this piece, and I do think it's similar in some ways, but it's a turban cover from the Ottoman Empire from the 18th century. And it does, I'm curious if you could speak to a little bit about the floral details here and why it sparked your interest.
It reminded me, well, I was drawn to it being a turban cover. So I felt like it kind of connected with multiple works. We'll be looking at cameo appearances where the women in the images or in that work, they have bonnets and shower caps and stocking caps on. And so I was just thinking about like the process of protecting your hair and covering it with bonnets and turbans and shower caps and those sorts of things. So I was interested in like the function of this, but also, again, just like those floral motifs and, you know, like thinking about how I also used flowers within my work to sort of like as a stand-in for, you know, mid-century deco and my grandmother and like the 60s and the 70s. And I just was really drawn to like that flower and the motif and how that could be tied to these two like strands of history as it relates to Black women and as it relates to my work. So that just really stood out to me. I also like that it was a square.
Yes.
Yeah. So I like the
shows up a lot in the boxes and a lot of your work.
Like, yeah, thinking about the square too.
It's also interesting to think about how work, or not work, but objects that we use and like the what predates that, right? Like thinking about, I definitely go and wear a bonnet to sleep. And so what was that in 3 centuries ago, and kind of how has it been developed over time is there's a lot of work to be done there. Mm-hmm. So now we've mentioned refutation of good hair, the refutation of good hair, but now we are here. This is your cousin to the left.
Uh-huh.
And I'm curious why refutation of good hair is different from your other series.
I actually made this work first.
Ah,
so that's like
a huge difference.
It was like the oldest. I made this was like the first work I made after Mia was born. There are actually non-figurative pictures included in this. But right now we're just looking at the figure, but for one, it was like the first work that it made. I think that I had experienced a lot prior to this, and I was sort of trying to reclaim a lot of things, was sort of like developing in my consciousness as it relates to like feminism and Black women's relationship to the movement. And I think this was like my example of like rage against the erasure of Black women within like the movement. And so I was really just sort of like thinking about Black women's beauty within the relationship of like Eurocentric beauty standards and like that power dynamic, and thinking about how ideologies sort of like we ingest them, we take them in, like the good hair phrase, you know, suggesting that like natural hair or curly hair or kinky, forcey hair is not desirable. I just given birth to my daughter, and I was like, you know what? My daughter gonna have 4C hair, and I dare somebody to say something to her about her hair. So I was just kind of like in a moment in my life where I just needed to make this really like declarative statement for Black women. And as you kind of like go through my work and see how I've developed, I've really sort of like mellowed out a little bit and sort of turned to like just wanting to love on Black women, or at least tell our stories in a way that if anyone comes to the work, they always kind of know that I'm coming from a place of love. And so this kind of came at like a very particular moment in my life where I had like a lot that I was trying to reclaim. But a
lot of things have changed since this series, or even during this time frame, right? And how we see natural hair, and it not just being tokenized, but also maybe not a threat to your employment, right? Yeah. Like there's like so many other things that have happened in that time that have shifted that for the better, right. I would say. Of course, more work to be done, but I think, maybe it was actually truly a different time in history for natural hair, at least in the US, at the time that you did this portrait. Not, just to give you a little, a little grace. I think it's important and to, to contextualize that we've come a long way in how we see a natural, straight, kinky, permed, processed, unprocessed hair.
And if you go through the series, you'll also see that like each figure, like when I was casting my friends, these are like all good friends of mine. We've all kind of like end up in different places, but at the time, like these were women that were really close to me. And I just had them show up, and this is how they showed up. And so I thought that was like also really important to talk about, because like Black women, we are so multifaceted and multidimensional. And you'll see that they all wear their hair in different styles in different ways. Like one girl has a weave, one has locks, one has a really low cut, one has a really large, beautiful afro. And so I do kind of have to remind myself that like look at what revealed itself to you within the work. So
yeah, absolutely. So we have one more series, I think maybe two more series actually to look at. Our second to last here is Cameo appearances. So in Cameo appearances, and also in the first image, X-pressions, Black beauty, still lifes, there's use of collage and assemblage. And I'm curious, is that how you also think about your still lifes, and vice versa, when you're thinking about these across these different styles and in your different series? Are you thinking about kind of how assemblage and collage works across the board?
Yeah, I think the way that I kind of bring the assemblage and the collage together, I kind of use them as like an evidence for my collecting, like whatever I've collected or whatever I've sourced. And I try and find multiples of whatever it is I'm interested in exploring, because I think that kind of helps the audience and the viewer see the trend that I'm sort of like working through and looking at. And so in terms of like collage, a lot of it is for the purpose of displaying what it is I've collected. So, you'll see like pages out of Black hair catalogs, like sort of like marketing magazines, like the hardbound marketing magazines, which will actually be the next slide. But also like product packaging. So looking at like the beauty supply store is really like my go-to place for when I'm looking for subject matter to photograph. I just go to the beauty supply store. Like, and
can I ask you another question?
Yeah.
Did you buy the magazines as a kid? Not to go totally off tangent, but did you buy those magazines as a kid with the hairstyles in them? Randy wears her hair like this. Oh my goodness. I love those.
I don't have any of those now. And these didn't actually come from those. These actually came from like, you know, trade style magazines. Like if you go into the salon and they're like, pick out your style. It's like from those books. And so these were all what I was when I was looking at them, I was looking at the geographic location. So these are from Virginia and Washington, D.C. On the left are all the salons from D.C. and then on the right are all the salons from Virginia. But they had salons from North Carolina and like upstate New York, New Jersey, like all these sort of like metropoles for like Black hair salons. And so I was like really interested in that and sort of organizing them in that way. But then I just kind of wanted to look at like what's repeating within them. The posture, the background, the light quality, like the facial expressions. And you start to really see that there's like something happening and developing that comes into our communities and becomes a part of like how Black women are circulated and images of us circulate. And so that just like the act of collecting and sort of like trying to see what can come out of what is collected is something that I find that like collage and assemblage really help me to sort of like organize and think through and be able to talk about in a way that makes sense.
Here. And I also have fond memories of being in the salon and looking at these images. It's so I don't know, it's kind of gratifying to see them as art.
Yeah.
To see them kind of as an art object versus like kind of like a worn device to like pick your hairstyle. Again, it's like this object that I really didn't consider. Like those hairstyle things are those magazines in like, you know, the grocery store or at your local bookstore or whatever. You know, they kind of were sensationalized, right? Because it would be celebrities in their hairstyles. But this is something that I think many people who went to the hairstylist used often because they were often very worn from just flipping through them so much. And I truly didn't think about like how the poses are so similar. The backgrounds are very similar. And also how it was a vehicle to promote salons around the country. And really kind of as a flex, right? To say like, hey, we're in this magazine, we're reputable, like we're doing great styles, etc. So now I have a new or a renewed sense of love for kind of this moment in not only my life, but just kind of the material culture itself.
I was also kind of thinking about just in terms of like, I spent a lot of time looking at sort of like beauty of the weeks and like Jets and Ebony's and thinking about like this idea of like the beauty queen within, you know, like what does like a modern, like what does that look like now? Like these were from the 2000s. This issue was 2011, I want to say. But like thinking about like that, again, that history of like Black beauty and how it shifted into like 99s into the 2000s. Like it's not like, oh, this is not your mom's beauty queen. This is kind of, you know what I mean? So I also was kind of interested in like coming into a more contemporary, not fully contemporary because 2011, you know, was almost a decade ago, but certainly if you look at some of my other work, I'm looking at like 1970s blow dryers and vinyls and things like that. So I do kind of feel like this is me kind of coming a little more into the moment of like, well, what was I looking at when I was, 18 and 19 and 20? Like, I was wearing micro braids. And so just kind of like engaging with, my youth a little bit, I suppose.
I wanted to end on this image, if you don't mind, as I have 2 last questions, if you wouldn't mind holding for a few minutes. How has your practice changed during the pandemic, and what are you looking forward to?
So my practice has really, I would say, like, what changed the most. I mean, I'm on a computer a lot more, just in terms of like, and just kind of engaging with the internet, thinking about how to have like virtual exhibitions. But in terms of the way I work, I've always kind of put my feet down where I was and worked where that was. So whether that was at a residency, at home, in my living room, in my kitchen, I've been able to continue to make work, and I'm grateful for that. What I'm looking forward to in the future, in 2021, next spring, I'll be having a solo show in New York, which I'm looking forward to, like, wrapping my head around that and starting to get prepared for that exhibition. So
into the new world of COVID era exhibition.
The new world. I don't know what that's going to look like, but
I'm sure it's going to be fantastic. And I think your work is needed at this time. I mean, it's needed always, but I think especially at this time. We do have one question from the audience. Allison asks, what is she taking into her work from everything that is happening in the world at this moment?
That Black women need a place a safe place where they can be, in terms of like, between the pandemic, like between violence against Black women and the need to be protected. I really do look at my work as like a place for Black women to come to feel safe, to feel seen, to have any degree of conversation, whether it's one where you're just kikiing and laughing and loving, or you're like really unpacking some of the issues that we sort of experience. And so I've always been consistent with wanting to center, Black women within my work. Oh, you're muted. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. What a wonderful way to end. It's just been a pleasure to hear you about your work and the evolution of your work today. And I think it's needed. And so first, I just want to thank you for being here and sharing your work and sharing about your family. It's just wonderful to hear and kind of how you're manifesting that into your work and just celebrating that. And celebrating Blackness in your work. And I want to thank our digital team, of course. Without this would not be possible. So thank you so much, and my team as well. And I want to thank you, the audience, because you're here, you're hanging out with us, you're continuing to support the work here at the Walters Art Museum. Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a good night. See you for now.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.